Here's the list of the most deranged serial killers of all time. Harold Shipman. Nicknamed Dr. Death, Harold Shipman is thought to be responsible for murdering 218 of his patients between 1972 and 1998. In reality, the number of people he murdered is likely much higher. As a practicing physician, Shipman had easy access to potential victims, which is why he was able to be such a prolific killer without raising suspicion. However, because Shipman was involved in so many cases in which patients died, people eventually began to suspect foul play. Most of his victims were elderly women, whom he said had died in their sleep, but many of these women died during the day, which struck some as odd. Additionally, Shipman asked for an unusually large number of cremation certificates, which caught the attention of an undertaker who reported the odd circumstances of the cremations. Eventually, Shipman was convicted in 2000, but only after a victim's daughter reported that he had tried to write a will for the victim that would name him as the beneficiary. He died by suicide in prison in 2004. Andrei Chikatilo. Between 1978 and 1990, the Russian serial killer Andrei Chikatilo sexually assaulted, murdered, and mutilated more than 50 young women and children. Chikatilo killed his victims by stabbing and slashing them with a knife. One of the youngest was 9 years old. Chikatilo later admitted that he was only able to achieve orgasm by stabbing women, a fact which made it difficult for him to resist his strong urges to kill. Chikatilo was nicknamed the Butcher of Rostov, the Red Ripper, and the Rostov Ripper. Though he confessed to a total of 56 brutal murders, he was tried for 53, sentenced to death, and executed by the firing squad in 1994. Jeffrey Dahmer. No list of the most deranged serial killers would be complete without Jeffrey Dahmer. Dahmer, known as the Milwaukee Cannibal, was ultimately convicted of murdering 17 young men over a 14-year period. But Dahmer didn't just murder them. He also raped, dismembered, and sometimes even kneed to his victims. During his trial, Dahmer admitted to drilling a hole into his victims' heads in an attempt to turn them into mindless sex slaves. Although Dahmer likely would have been executed for his crimes, he was beaten to death in prison in 1994. Albert Fish. When a serial killer is dubbed the Brooklyn Vampire, the Moon Maniac, the Werewolf of Wisteria, the Gray Man, and the Boogeyman, it's almost certain he is thoroughly deranged. Fish was tried and found guilty of raping, killing, and cannibalizing 3 children in the early 1900s. However, he claimed that he had murdered more than 100 children, and even boasted that he had children in every state. Especially deranged is the fact that Fish sent a letter to the mother of one of his victims, 10-year-old Grace Budd. The letter detailed how he had lured the little girl, strangled her, and then cut her into pieces to eat over the course of 9 days. John Wayne Gacy. There's deranged, and then there's the type of deranged that describes the serial killer John Wayne Gacy. He was nicknamed Killer Clown because of his job attending children's birthday parties and charitable events as Pogo the Clown. His occupation gave him easy access to potential victims. Gacy was convicted of raping, torturing, and murdering 33 teenage boys over a 6-year period. He would lure them to his home, kill them via either strangulation or asphyxiation, then bury them on his property. Gacy was executed in 1994. Ted Bundy. You don't have to be American or have been around in the 1970s to know the name Ted Bundy. Bundy is easily one of the most deranged serial killers, not to mention kidnappers, rapists, burglars, and necrophiles of all time. His modus operandi included kidnapping his female victims, raping them, and then dismembering them. He often kept their heads as souvenirs. Before he was executed in 1989, Bundy admitted to kidnapping and murdering 30 women, though this number is almost certainly much higher. Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper may be a name that everyone knows, but no one can be certain of his true identity. Whoever he or she really was, Jack the Ripper was definitely deranged. In 1888, Jack the Ripper terrorized the Whitechapel neighborhood of London by slitting the throats and abdomens of at least 5 prostitutes and leaving them for dead. Sometimes, he would even remove the woman's uterus and take it as a sort of prize. It's unlikely Jack the Ripper's true identity will ever be figured out, but ripperology, the study and analysis of the murders, has certainly inspired quite a few what-if novels and films over the years. Joachim Kroll. German serial killer Joachim Kroll murdered at least 14 people, including young children, between 1955 and 1976. After strangling his victims with his bare hands, Kroll would have sex with their corpses, then cut them up in pieces to eat. Interestingly, Kroll was finally caught after a neighbor complained about a backup in the plumbing. The pipes were clogged with human remains. When Krall was arrested, he was in the process of simmering body parts taken from his most recent victim, 4-year-old Marion Ketter. Joseph James Dingello. Though his crimes occurred decades ago, between 1974 and 1986, Joseph James Dingello wasn't identified as the Golden State Killer until DNA evidence from one of the crimes was used to match with a close relative of DeAngelo's, which led to his identification and arrest. Over the course of 3 separate crime sprees, Dingello murdered at least 13 people, raped more than 50, and committed well over 100 burglaries. One of the reasons why Dingello was able to evade identification and capture for so long is because he was a former police officer. His training undoubtedly helped him in planning and executing his crimes while minimizing the physical evidence he left behind. In fact, he was known to have called some of his victims months before he attacked them so he could learn about their routines to plan his crimes. In some instances, he even broke into the homes of his victims so he could unlock doors and windows and even leave items like ropes and other ligatures he could use to tie up his victims upon his return. One of the most chilling aspects of DeAngelo's crimes is that he often taunted his victims, staying for hours in their homes, ransacking it, eating their food, and threatening to kill their families. In some cases, he targeted couples whom he would separate. He would sometimes force the female victim to tie up the male victim. He would then place plates on the male victim's back so he could hear the victim try to move. Dingello would then commence raping the female victim in another room. Dingello was also known to hide in the home, tricking his victims into thinking that he'd left, only to jump out of the shadows. He would often take souvenirs of his crimes with him as trophies to remind him of what he'd done. Pedro Lopez. Pedro Lopez's deranged killing spree is terrifying enough, but perhaps even more terrifying is the fact that Lopez's current whereabouts are unknown. The native of Colombia claims to have raped and killed more than 300 women across Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. At least 100 of these were tribal women. In 1980, the monster of the Andes was arrested and led police to the graves of 53 victims between the ages of 9 and 12. Lopez was found guilty of murdering 110 girls in Ecuador. He also confessed to an additional 240 murders in Peru and Colombia and was declared insane. Incredibly, Lopez was released in 1998 for good behavior, and while there are plenty of rumors, no one can confirm exactly where he is today. Gilles de Rais. Gilles de Rais was a wealthy knight and lord, a leader in the French army, and a companion in arms to Joan of Arc. He was also a totally deranged serial killer. Between 1432 and 1433, Gilles reportedly sodomized and then murdered or ordered the murder of at least 40 children. Many naked bodies of young boys were found at his estate in 1437. A 1971 biography of Rais describes the way the knight lured the boys to their deaths. He outfitted them in fancy clothing and provided them with a large meal and lots of wine. Finally, he confronted each boy with the true nature of his situation and murdered them. Richard Ramirez. For more than a year during the 1980s, Richard Ramirez terrorized neighborhoods throughout Los Angeles. Nicknamed Night Stalker, Ramirez would break into homes and brutally murder his victims, sometimes raping them first. His victims ranged from early 20s to a 79-year-old woman. His weapons of choice included handguns, knives, a tire iron, a machete, and even a hammer. Ramirez never expressed any remorse for his crimes. He was sentenced to death but died of lymphoma before he could be executed. H.H. Holmes. Of all the deranged serial killers on this list, H.H. Holmes might be the one most people are unfamiliar with. Holmes was a con artist who moved to Chicago in 1885 and began work in a pharmacy. He built a building near the pharmacy that he used as his base for killing his victims, which number anywhere from 20 to 200. The height of his activity as a serial killer was during the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago. The fair brought thousands of people to the city, and Holmes capitalized on all the newcomers by offering rooms in his building as accommodations for visitors. Later called the Murder Castle, the building Holmes constructed had multiple hidden rooms where he would torture his victims, whom he eventually killed. The building was outfitted with a series of chutes and trapdoors that allowed him to easily remove the bodies of his victims from the upper floors and relocate them to the basement, where the bodies were typically burned in a kiln. Holmes was put to death in 1896 after his conviction for murdering an associate of his, Benjamin P. Tezel.